everyone. So we're going to be talking about tefillah, one of my favorite topics. Like we've mentioned in the past, there's this Gemara in Brachot, Daf Kafvav Amud Bet, that says that the three Avot, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each established a different one of the tefillah. And the Gemara there goes through a source to prove why for each of the Avot we know that they established a tefillah. It starts with Abraham and says Abraham, when the city of Sodom was being destroyed, Abraham got up and petitioned from God not to destroy the city, and the word it uses there is omeid, he stood before God, and ein amida ela tefillah. Standing is clearly a reference to prayer. That's how we know Abraham established a davening. Then we have Yitzchak went out lasuach basadeh, to kind of roam around, meditate, have a conversation in the field. And the Gemara says, ein sicha ela tefillah. This having a conversation is also a reference to prayer. That's how we know Yitzchak established a tefillah. And Yaakov, well, that comes from this week's parsha. The beginning of parsha Vayeitzei, it says Vayifga b'makom, that when Yaakov was running away from his brother Esav to his uncle Lavan, Yaakov stumbled upon a place, and the stumbling, the Vayifga, the Gemara says ein pegia ela tefillah, that the stumbling upon a place is clearly a reference to prayer, which is a cool Gemara, and we're not going to get so much into the Gemara right now, but what I want to look at is Onkelos. Right? Targum Onkelos is this commentary that translates all the psukim into Aramaic, and the Gemara says that it's not that this guy Onkelos came up with all these translations, he just revived it, but really these Aramaic translations were given from Har Sinai, which means that each of these translations have a lot of weight to them, because they essentially come from God themselves. And if we look at the three translations from these three psukim that the Gemara quotes as the sources for tefillah, we see something very interesting. Because when it comes to Abraham, the Amida pasuk, the standing in front of God, the Onkelos translates when the pasuk says El Hamakom Asher Amad Sham Lifnei Hashem, that Abraham stood in front of God. Onkelos translated it as La'atra Deshamish Taman Bitzilo Kadam Hashem, where Abraham served God in prayer. Bitzilo, that the tzla'a is the Aramaic word for prayer. Similarly, by Yitzchak, when the pasuk says Vayeitzei Yitzchak lasuach basadeh, Yitzchak went out to have this conversation in the field. How does Onkelos translate the word sicha, to have a conversation? V'nafak Yitzchak letzala'a b'chakla, that Yitzchak went out to pray, to daven in the field. But when it comes to Yaakov, how does Onkelos translate the phrase vayifga b'makom, that Yaakov stumbled upon a place? Onkelos doesn't translate it as v'tzala'a ba'atra, that he prayed in the place. Onkelos rather translates it according to the simple meaning of the pasuk, v'ara ba'atra, that Yaakov indeed stumbled upon a place. Which is weird, because why would Targum Onkelos only follow the Gemara in Brachot for the first two, for Abraham and Yitzchak, but not translate the pasuk about Yaakov according to the Gemara in Brachot? So that's our first question, but really it's just a simple technical question about Onkelos. But it leads us to a broader question, because the answer to this question can clearly be derived from context. If we look at the context by Abraham, it makes sense why this is a pasuk that's referring to tefillah. Abraham is petitioning God not to destroy the city of Sodom. That's a perfect source for prayer. When it comes to Yitzchak is standing alone in his field, meditating. It makes sense why this is a source for prayer. That's a very prayerful act. But when it comes to Yaakov, you look at the context by Yaakov is running away from his brother, and it's late at night, and he's tired, and the sun is setting, and he stumbles upon a place, and he goes to sleep. This doesn't seem like a pasuk that would be the source for prayer. So yes, it makes sense why Onkelos wouldn't translate this pasuk about Yaakov by using the word vitzala'ah, that Yaakov prayed, because the context doesn't make sense for this to be talking about prayer. But that raises the bigger, more fundamental question: why is this the pasuk by Yaakov that teaches tefillah? From Abraham and Yitzchak, we get it why the Gemara picked the psukim that they did. But by Yaakov, why is this event at the beginning of Parsha Vayeitzei the event that teaches us that Yaakov established a tefillah? So in order to understand this, we have to look later in Parsha Vayeitzei to truly get a sense of who Yaakov was and his relationship with God and his relationship with prayer. When Yaakov gets married, and he marries Leah and he marries Rachel, two sisters, and Leah has 4 kids and Rachel has no kids, Rachel gets a little upset. She gets jealous and super dramatically turns to Yaakov, says, Yaakov, havali banim, give me kids, v'im ayin, and if you don't give me kids, meta anochi, I'm going to die. And all the commentaries explain that Rachel was essentially asking Yaakov to daven for her, to ask God to provide her with kids. And what does Yaakov do? Yaakov turns to Rachel, looks her in the eye, and says, Hatachad Elokim anochi asher mana minech privatan? Am I, instead of God, am I the one who has prevented you from having kids? No, God is the one who prevented you from having kids. I can't daven on your behalf. If you want to daven, you go daven, but that's not something that I can do for you. And yes, the commentaries try to justify why Yaakov said what he said and why it really made sense and that was the right response in the moment. But just looking at the pshat, it seems pretty bad. What's going on in Yaakov's head? Why couldn't he just daven for his wife Rachel? Unless this wasn't who Yaakov was. Abraham and Yitzchak were people who davened. Yaakov wasn't necessarily a person who davened. Meaning, you look throughout the entirety of Parsha Vayeitzei. Yaakov never once turns to God and asks God for help. Not when Lavan was cheating him. Not when Yaakov wanted to be prosperous with his sheep. Even looking at the rest of Yaakov's life. When Yosef was taken away from him, Yaakov doesn't daven. When any significant event happens in Yaakov's life, in nearly none of those events does Yaakov daven. Yaakov isn't a prayerful person. Now, it's not that Yaakov didn't believe in God or Yaakov didn't daven at all. It's true, the beginning of next week's Parsha, in Parsha Vayeshlach, when Esav is attacking Yaakov, and Yaakov feels like he doesn't have any other choice, he turns to God and begs, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav, please save me from my brother Esav. But this isn't the norm in Yaakov's life. And it seems to be that unlike his father and grandfather, Yaakov only davened in completely desperate situations where there was absolutely no other option. Otherwise, Yaakov did his ishtadlus, he did his part, he tried to come to solutions naturally and with his own strength, and only when there was absolutely no other option did he turn to God in prayer. Why is this all necessary to answer our question? Because let's go back to our story about Vayifga b'makom. Why is it that this event at the beginning of the Parsha, where Yaakov stumbles upon a place and just falls asleep at the beginning of Vayeitzei, why is this the source for Yaakov establishing a tefillah? We have to recognize that these three events that the Gemara quotes in Brachot aren't three events in which the Avot pray necessarily, but it's there to teach us three different kinds of tefillah. It's something we spoke about in the past. Tefillah is about our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and essentially the source for Abraham establishing a tefillah, and Yitzchak establishing a tefillah, and Yaakov establishing a tefillah are essentially the sources for three different kinds of relationships with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gemara said by Abraham in Amida Ela Tefillah, that Abraham's kind of tefillah, his kind of relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, was that of Amida, was that of standing. Because Abraham, that's what he was. He was a promoter of God. He was an influencer. And we see that Abraham is constantly Korei b'Shem Hashem. He's constantly calling out in God's name. He went out and made a good name for God, and he put on this good reputation for God. Yitzchak had a different kind of relationship with God. We say by Yitzchak, in sicha ela tefillah, that Yitzchak just having a conversation is his form of tefillah, is his form of relationship with God, because that's who Yitzchak was. Yitzchak was a much more introverted, much more quiet, much more reserved, much more natural person when it comes to his relationship with God, and that's who he was by the Akedah. He was someone who experienced God's hand, God saving his life. It makes sense for Yitzchak to be this way, and we explained this last week, that Yitzchak is much more passive in the sense that he doesn't have to try to put out a name for God, to stand up for God, because it comes natural for him. That's just what his personality is. That's what his relationship with God is. Both Abraham and Yitzchak's relationship with God are constant all the time, but in different ways. Abraham is much more active, and Yitzchak is much more passive. But then we get to Yaakov, and Yaakov is completely different. Yaakov's relationship with God is Pegia, in Pegia Ela Tefillah. It's this chancing upon. It's this stumbling upon. Yaakov doesn't have a constant relationship with God, but it's kind of a relationship where it only actively comes out when he desperately needs it. Again, not that Yaakov doesn't believe in God the rest of the time, but Yaakov isn't going to actively engage in that conversation, actively turn to God, unless he absolutely needs it, unless he chances upon, he's pogea in a situation where he has no other choice. He's stuck in a foxhole, and he has to look up and pray to God for help. And that's why it's this story, a story where Yaakov doesn't daven, that's the source for Yaakov's prayer. Because we want to contrast Yaakov's kind of tefillah and Yaakov's kind of relationship with God with the relationship that Abraham had, with the relationship that Yitzchak had, which were both constant relationships. Because Yaakov didn't have a constant relationship with God. He only had a relationship with God when he absolutely needed it. And that's why we dafka picked a story where Yaakov doesn't pray to God, in order to show that Yaakov's relationship with God was something that wasn't evident all the time and didn't come out 100% of the time. Because in times that Yaakov felt that he was able to conquer situations on his own, then he did conquer situations on his own. We say that the Avot didn't just, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov didn't just establish tefillah in theory, but they each established a specific tefillah. Avraham established Shachar, Yitzchak established Mincha, and Yaakov established Marav. And this comment of the Gemara is significant, because if you look at the nature of each of these tefillot, it makes sense why the Avot with a certain personality created this tefillah that also has a certain personality. Because, like we said, Yaakov is someone who doesn't daven all the time, constantly, but he only reaches out to God when he absolutely needs to, and that's essentially what Marav is. The Gemara, and we pass in the halacha, that Marav is a reshus, is optional. And again, without getting into the technical halachic definition of what that means, because every male does have an obligation to daven Marav, in the hashkafa of it, the concept of Marav being reshus makes a lot of sense. Because Marav isn't supposed to be a prayer that's obligatory, that we have to do. It has to be something where we have to be pogea on it. When we reach a situation where we need to call out to God, then we call out to God. But not because it's forced upon us, but because it's coming internally, because that's something we choose to do. And we see that in the various ways the Gemara describes Marav, where the Mishnah says the time for davening Marav, it's not that it starts here and ends here, rather Marav ein la keva. It doesn't have a set time, because Marav isn't a kind of tefillah that fits into the framework of having a set time. Similarly, if we look in the parallel to Marav in the Beit HaMikdash, Shachar and Mincha are each parallel to korbanot that were brought every single day. But Marav is parallel to the hektar evarim v'chalavim, the burning of the excess fats and limbs that were left over that hadn't been burnt during the day. Meaning there were some days that there were excess fats and limbs and they were burnt, and sometimes there were not excess fats and limbs, and therefore there was nothing to be burnt that night. And that's essentially what Marav is. If you need to daven, you daven it. If you don't daven, then you don't daven it. Now, at the end of the day, we at least the males in Judaism, have accepted upon ourselves to take Marav as a chuva, as an obligatory prayer. But that doesn't mean that we've accepted it for it to become another kind of shacharit, where it's something where we act, where we just constantly do it without thinking about it, without activating the emotional side of it. We have to daven Marav not as a shacharit, but even though Marav is now obligatory, we have to daven an obligatory Marav still as a Marav, something that still has the spirit of a reshus, that has the spirit of something being optional. And it's easy to do, which is why we daven Marav at nighttime, because the emunat chabalelo, nighttime is a time of darkness, it's a time of fear, it's a time of insecurity, it's a time where it's easy to reach out to God, not because we have to, but because it comes from the heart, because it's the time where we feel that we need God the most. And essentially, we have these three tefillot from each of the three avot in order to access a different kind of relationship with God, so we can maximize on these three kinds of relationships with God 3 times a day. We daven Shacharit as an Abraham tefillah, as an Amida, where we actively differentiate our day, and we get up and we start our day differently than everyone else, and daven this really long shacharit, because we're standing in front of God and we're calling out and we're showing that God is different and God is special, and we're being influencers for God, and that's the shacharit, that's the Abraham, that's the Amida. Mincha is different. Mincha, the only way we could daven mincha is if it's the natural part of our day. It's like Yitzchak, where it's a sicha, it's a conversation. It makes sense for us. It's not something where we're actively going out and trying to do, but it's just a natural continuation of who we are. And Yaakov, he established Marav because that's who Yaakov was. He was a person who didn't daven all the time, but he davened only when he needed to at night, and it came not from externally, from any obligation, but internally, because he really felt it in the heart. And we have to make sure when we daven, whether you're a man and you have an obligation to daven Marav, or whether you're a woman and you don't have an obligation to daven Marav, but once in a while you feel that you need to call out to God in the same way Yaakov did, you're pogea in a situation that demands you to call out to God in prayer. So we got to do whatever these situations call of us. And whether you're davening a shacharit in a shacharit way, or mincha in a mincha way, or Marav in a Marav way, or every one of those tefillot, one day everyone is going to be a shacharit kind of tefillah, or every day it's going to be a mincha kind of tefillah, or every day it's going to be a Marav kind of tefillah. We have to do what's right. But it's important for us to train ourselves to access these 3 kinds of relationships with God that are modeled in these 3 tefillot that were presented by our 3 avot in order to have well-rounded, well-balanced relationships with God and relationships with tefillah. Okay, wow, that was a lot. May have been too much, and I apologize, but I think it's super important. Okay? Everybody have a great Shabbos. Bye-bye.